Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this series, I speak to people who can help us to understand human decision-making and what we can do to mitigate the risks of it. Now, if you've been a long-time listener to the series, you'll know that I speak to a range of guests, including behavioural science practitioners, those with personal experience of human risk, and academics. My aim is to try to get different perspectives. In common with many other people, I fall into the behavioural science field by accident, rather than having formally studied it. But then, it didn't exist as an option when I went to university. Nowadays, you can study it, which is why I thought it would be interesting to get the perspective of those who are. So on this episode, I'm speaking to two PhD students, Sarah Bowen and Merle van den Akker, to get their insights about behavioural science. Sarah and Merle are also the hosts of the Questioning Behaviour podcast that looks at behavioural science topics from the perspective of PhD students. In our discussion, we explore the challenges of bringing the findings of academic research of behaviour into the real world and some insights into what it's like to be studying behavioural science. So please enjoy my conversation with Sarah and Merle. So Sarah and Merle, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Hi, Christine. Thanks for having us.
Listen, it's my absolute pleasure to have you. And I guess before we start sort of digging into the nitty-gritty of behavioural science, can you both give my listeners a sense of who you are, what your interest in behavioural science is, and anything else that you think is relevant? So why don't we start with you, Sarah?
So my name is Sarah. I'm a PhD student, currently studying at the University of Nottingham, very interested in behavioural science and have been sort of trying to gather knowledge about the subject for the past couple of years. And a couple of months ago, as lockdown was hitting us in the UK, I roped my friend Merle into starting a podcast with me. So, we have our own podcast that is, I think we are on episode 22. It's been an experience. It's been great.
So, hey, everyone. My name's Merle. Just like Sarah, I'm a PhD student, but I'm at the Warwick Business School. I'm also interested in behavioral science. I started a blog in it about 2 years ago, which is Money on the Mind, which predominantly focused on how people handle money, because that's my main interest within behavioral science. And just as Sarah said, about half a year-ish ago, Sarah got bored and we started a podcast.
And I love that because I think there's probably, I'd probably exaggerate slightly, but millions of podcasts that started during lockdown in the same way that lots of people's cooking habits were increased. There were lots of people that kind of jumped into zone. And certainly this one that started before, but was kind of turbocharged. But I'm kind of interested. So you've both got this passion for this subject. Can you just talk my listeners through a little bit about, how does the podcast work? What's the focus of it? What sort of guests do you look for? So that if they were interested in listening to it, what can they expect?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're doing the plugs a bit early, but I'll embrace that.
I like to get them out of the way because otherwise there's a risk with the amount I talk that we forget.
Okay, well, so we basically have a format where it's us two having a conversation about behavioural science and actually how little we know about the subject, despite being PhD students 1 year away from submitting our theses, plural. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect, like in complete action. The more we learn, the more we talk to people and experience, the less that we know, or the less that we realize we know. So every episode, we try and bring on a guest who has some experience with behavioral science in an area of the world and an area of behavior that we have, no more experience in than just going about our daily lives. And sort of we have these sort of throwaway extra episodes as well, where we just have a conversation and talk each other's ear off for 30 minutes, more about moaning about the PhD and discussing academia and what the hell we're doing and why we decided to do it in the first place, which existential crises galore. But no, it's been fun.
Many regrets we have for choosing a PhD, things we could have done with our time, the accumulated opportunity cost.
Yes, that's such an economist phrase for you to use, Merle.
I'm trying so hard. I'm not an economist, so for me to be called a behavioural economist, I always find quite funny.
I spent a lot of time having this behavioural science versus behavioural economics discussion. Same. It's funny because I don't see myself as a scientist because I always think of that somebody wearing a lab coat sitting with, test tubes and things. So that's one. And then the other hand, I go, well, I'm not an economist, right? Because that's a sort of pointy-headed person. And I used to work with a few at the Bank of England who really were proper economists. So I kind of go, where do I sit? So I tend to go towards the behavioural science side rather than the economic. And then I wrap myself into all sorts of trouble when I'm trying to define the difference. I prefer to sort of look at it generally as it's all the same thing, which is answering that really interesting question of why the hell do we do what we do? And with that in mind, I'm always fascinated when I speak to people that do behavioral science podcasts, because as we were saying before we started recording, you have spoken to a whole load of people in this field and therefore will have gleaned a whole host of insight around this stuff. What is it that's kind of, if I sort of said, what are the key things you've learned in those discussions, or things that have surprised you, if you don't want to kind of summarize the whole lot in one thing?
I think the most interesting things I've learned is that there is much more to behavioral science than a lot of people think. So initially, obviously, behavioral science got popularized through, two Nobel Prize winners who had quite a background in either prospect theory or nudge. And especially nudge took off also with the popular science book, the titular Nudge. And a lot of stuff that Ariely did. And so that is the type of behavioral science that really got to the forefront. And that is the type of behavioral science that most people, once they enter the field, that's what they know. Sarah and I have been in the field a bit longer and from a different perspective, but even then you kind of stay in your niche. So in Sarah's case, that is actually still quite a lot of nudging, but just a lot deeper than the more superficial nudges go. In my case, it's predominantly big data. So they're just very different approaches. And the more you speak to people especially people who've been in this field before it got called behavioral science, they really show you a wealth of methods and a wealth of insight and what this was like before, it started raining Nobel Prizes and everyone jumped on the bandwagon. And I think from them hear how they started in a field that didn't have a label yet and how they then progressed in it and how the field progressed. And to hear from them what they think the future of the field is, or to hear their criticisms about what the field has been and what the field is and is going to become. I think that's just, I'd very happily listen 7 hours a day to that, because I think there's so much to be gained from people, who were there before behavioral science had a label. I think there's loads of interesting stuff to discuss there. Yeah,
and I think the only thing I would add is, for me personally, being young and never really been employed outside of academia, it's been really interesting to hear all the different pathways that people have taken to arrive at where they currently are.
Yeah.
Which has been fascinating because, in my head, when I think about role models and sort of career paths, from an academia perspective, it's very linear. Like, you have to have been interested from a very young age and, published this amount and gone up the academic ladder, and then maybe branch out into industry and, become someone influential in behavioral science. So,
or at least have the right degrees. Whereas no one above, I think, the age of 40 in this field could possibly have what we now call the right degrees, because it didn't exist. And that's just great.
Right. And also you sort of realize how it's not necessarily important. Like, actually, the thing that we've heard again and again from the question, how did you get into behavioral science, is that people always sort of have the same response of, well, I've always been a behavioral scientist, but I just didn't really know that I was until I found sort of my tribe of people and realized, I've been thinking about things this way this entire time. I just didn't have the phrase to call this loss aversion or to name this a specific bias, attribution bias or something like that. So, that's been really fascinating.
And I think that's a really interesting point around the discipline, because, as you say, and there's plenty of famous quotes. I think there's the Amos Tversky one around, all we're doing is codifying what used car salespeople have known for many decades. This idea that, behavioral science is not a new technique. It's almost explaining something that we intuitively understand. And I mean, my story, I'd add to the mix and just say I was one of those kids that was just irritatingly go, why?
Same.
And for some reason that I don't understand, but I'm eternally grateful for, my parents kind of indulged it probably more than they should have done. And so was born this kind of innate interest in what the hell is going on out. And I came into this discipline, as you say, and sort of went, okay, so there's some people that really look at this stuff and there's some science behind it to justify my inherent curiosity. And so I'm fascinated by the fact that it's sort of it's this stuff has always been there. It's been relatively well understood, because we know, particularly in the retail context, that a lot of these techniques they're now being explored and studied and better understood are there all along. And so there's a lot of people like me that kind of haven't got the academic piece. And then we're now backfilling nicely. And you're in that. And this is one of the other reasons I want to speak to you is I think you're in this fascinating stage where you're kind of providing the academic hinterland and the new research to help support this discipline that's kind of naturally evolved. I'm sort of fascinated as to how you find that, where you're sat in a field where you're studying it and there are people out there who've sort of been doing this stuff. How does that sit nicely together?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's strange because inside, academic life, it's a very insular bubble. Like, you could go through the whole PhD and never speak to anyone who's actually applying behavioural science, outside of academia. That's so easy. And that's really what the majority of people do. I mean, so I'm a bit of background. I've been trained as an economist. So I did economics and then transitioned to behavioural economics. And I'm now sat in an economics department doing behavioural science economics. So transitioning to the behavioural science slowly. But I think it's nice because if you make the active decision to sort of look outside of your field, you realize that it's an absolute complement to what we're doing. And I think it's an absolute reminder of, the fact that this research that we're doing is not necessarily always externally valid. A lot of the time we're focusing on internal validity. So within a lab, can we control for different factors and try to isolate out do we think is driving this effect? Or can we say that this thing isn't actually having an effect on behavior? That's all well and good in an insular bubble, but, having to actually communicate that with people outside of the bubble and try and pull what's actually interesting and what people are actually going to use, it's a challenge. But I think on the whole, it completely complements the field. And it's been kind of fascinating to come into the field sort of externally. So I think I read Nudge when it came out. I don't know. I don't want to say how young I was because it would be quite embarrassing. But I think I was maybe like 12 or 14. And
I was 5 years old and I forced my parents to, like kind of really precocious child, forced my parents to go to the bookshop because I knew I wanted to.
I came out of the womb and my first words were Dan Ariely.
My dad is like, he's always worked in retail. So he's like in management. He always had all these books about consumer behavior and management and, industry and theory of like management, all of these sort of things. And he was giving me books on like how to draw mind maps at 7, and he would like deliver Freakonomics under my door. I think I've been like trained to the position I am now by my parents, very much so. But
I am the same. It's actually quite bad. So my dad is most of his life was an accountant. He's now a financial consultant. But to be quite honest, my dad taught us from a very young age how to manage your personal finances and how to manage them well. Took maybe a while before I caught on to that advice, but it would totally explain my current fascination with consumer finance or behavioral finance, if you will. So for us, it's a nurture thing. We blame our dads. If you don't like us as behavioral scientists, you can take this up with my dad. You can write an angry letter.
And we'll put his email address in the show notes.
Sure.
There's something really interesting, I think, about this laboratory conditions versus, quote unquote, the real world. Replication crisis is the sort of scientific headline. Things that work in a laboratory condition that maybe you've tried something on a bunch of students doesn't necessarily replicate in the office environment in very simple terms. And there's differences between culture. But, what's fascinating here is I think it all depends on how you look at the study. I can see that people approach it and sort of say, if you put two chemicals together, they will generally react the same, whether it's in a laboratory or somewhere else, providing the conditions are the same. So you're kind of testing something that is going to operate in the real world. And so, the whole basis of engineering and chemistry and all these sorts of things are that test it in the laboratory, and we can see this with COVID. He said bringing the C word into the conversation relatively early.
And it's demonetized.
You test that in the lab, and you've got a pretty good chance of it working in the real world. Whereas, behavioral science is an interesting one because you test it in the lab, and for a whole multitude of very legitimate reasons that don't undermine the quality of the experiment, it doesn't necessarily replicate. And I think it's fun to watch people freaking out. But this doesn't work in the real world. And I think that's missing the point of what the behavioral science research is going to get into, because it's not saying here is a definitive equation that's going to hold true forever. It's more of a hint as to what might the causes of this be, and how can, if you're trying to solve this problem in the real world, you approach that?
I'm not entirely sure I agree, but I have to admit I don't do any lab work because for my specific topic it has absolutely no internal nor external validity. My issue with a lot of the earlier research, and this is not hating on just economics, a lot of fields struggle with this if they test people, is just that the samples that we've tested are undergraduate students, predominantly white, very highly educated because they're in university, relatively rich. I mean, that is still the case. It just is. They are put into a lab, but they've got a very specific background, and it's quite normal. And I'm not that concerned about them being in a lab. I'm predominantly concerned about their background, who they are, and also that there's 40 of them. And then this task is relatively simplified, but what you're dealing with is that a person is almost like a river. Like the circumstances that a person is you won't find it twice. And that is, no, but it's just, I mean, there is this saying of like, you'll never find the same river twice, right? I think it's very difficult to find the same person twice because only one thing has to shift. Like I might be just a bit more hungry, or I slept absolutely terrible that night. And there are decisions that I will now make differently, or things that I will approach differently just because of that. And it is very difficult to control for. And although I appreciate getting to some core principles in a lab where I try to control for everything, which is still very, very hard because I still can't control how well you slept unless you're testing in a sleep lab, it is very difficult to even then get something that would remain constant throughout. And that's not because it's in a lab, that's just because of how people are. And so I'm quite happy, or I'm quite interested in the field of this systems thinking, where most of these decision nodes, rather than approaching them individually, which we have for decades, so I mean, we do have some insight into what's going on, but now we're trying to integrate them into chronological or just any type of process where we know there is much more complexity, and we can figure out that some things in certain contexts do happen or don't happen, to put it quite simple. And it's just, I feel like we're gonna have to get there, and I hope that field develops quite well, because this looking at individual decision nodes, although very valuable, can't tell you anything about what a person does in real life, because by the time someone has shown up to a lab, they've left their bed, they've chosen not to have breakfast or to have breakfast, they've put their clothes on, God knows what they did transport-wise to get to the lab.
You hope they've put their clothes on, but
We hope, we assume there is some normality going on there. But by this stage, they've made so many decisions, and the day before and the week before, it all carries over into this moment. And with a lot of individual decision tasks, that's not really being looked into. Whereas a person's complex, and this is always going to matter. And this is just, I mean, there's context and there's context. And the latter, what I just described, is just very difficult to get to.
I have to say, I mean, I actually agree with Christian on the original point, but I think Merle raises a really good point. So the first point about, you know, the fact that behavioral science is very weird, you know, which is this Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I always mix them up.
I'm so pleased you did that, because I always get trapped in the half about where you got trapped. I always get trapped in that one, so I try not to summarize it and just go, everybody knows what that means. But thank you for going through that, because I think it's important to specify.
It's all right. It was a group effort, but it's very true. I mean, I think it's also just a result of, you know, the way academia is structured and where money is and influences in the research community, and that is, you know, the United States and then Europe. So, you know, if you only have access to students who are on your campuses for this type of work, then you're naturally going to just sort of develop this bubble where, you know, a lot of the lab research is done on this, you know, it's not necessarily a homogenous group, but it's a group that has sort of shared characteristics that we can point to, that we know, or we have strong evidence that will affect people's behavior. I mean, culture, for one of them. So I think this weird bias is really important. And, but I think that you can obviously have a result that you find replicates in weird populations, and it's still a valid result. You just need to have the caveat that this was only really tested on people from, you know, these countries or who lived in these communities. And I think, you know, I feel like I have to defend, you know, experiments and lab experiments a little bit, because I'm the same as well. I always like to refer to within the lab as, this sort of separate spaceship that's been launched into space that's so removed from our reality that, how can we possibly imagine that what we see in here could actually be seen exactly in the outside world? But they're both the real world, right? It's both places, on Earth with people who make decisions every day. It's just a sort of a constructed world. So, part of the benefit that we get from having this laboratory control is that we can investigate questions that would be impossible to investigate in the real world. I mean, unless you took a systems thinking approach like Merle was talking about and just had data for everything, every decision a person makes, or conscious or unconscious, or every emotion that they have. Like if you had all of that data, yes, it would be an absolute mess to try and clean, but you could probably draw some correlations and influences about external stimuli. So, the color of a leaflet and how well, you absorb the information, like these types of questions. You could probably do something with that. But the question would be about, how ethical is that? How realistic is it, that we're going to actually have data that rich? And also data collection is imperfect,
Oh, yeah.
It's done by people, like the people who decide what questions we ask in these surveys determine the research that gets done. So I think, for example, if there was a group, and I'm just going to pick men, I'm sorry, men, I'm not attacking you, but if it's just a board of men, maybe you don't ask questions that relate to, so much about childcare and, working, trying to balance that. Yeah, female health, and, and it could be the same if it was a group of white people, or a group of people from the upper echelons of society. It's this sort of empathy gap. As long as we're human and we have empathy gaps, we're not always going to be asking the right questions that are going to be pertinent for everyone or anyone. So
the silly thing really around that diversity, cognitive diversity, for want of a better phrase, which clearly comes through having different experiences, backgrounds, and so on. The bit I find interesting is even if you were creating rules and policies for a very homogenous society, it would make sense to have some other people in the room to provide some new ideas and fresh thinking around how you might do that. Now, the fact is we're not doing it for homogenized populations, and so it makes even more sense. But I would say even a sort of pure argument that sort of says, okay, well, I'm just literally thinking about this subset of the population. Having diversity of thinking, even in that situation, makes a heck of a lot of sense. So it sure as hell makes a lot of sense when you've got a broader population that you need to have the representative views of. I think when we look at lack of cognitive diversity, I think it fails at the most basic levels, let alone before we even get into the kind of social and moral arguments as to why it makes sense and the practical arguments as to why it makes sense. Even in those sort of homogenized situations, fresh ideas is no bad thing.
Yeah.
I feel like you would be a massive supporter of John Rawls, the philosopher.
Go on.
Okay, no, so John Rawls is a political philosopher from, I don't know when. And he came up with the idea that the fairest of societies is a society where everyone comes to the debates, which is one hell of a referendum, but not knowing, so having this type of veil of ignorance seems to be a key term of his philosophy, where you are going to design the society together. So who gets what resources, who gets what status, like every resource you could think of would have to be split and assigned to certain roles. But then the people who are deciding it, they would partake in the society, but they would design it not knowing what role they would be in. So it would be the most fairest division of resources, or the most fairest division of whatever you can think of within society. So you would have a wealth of views, but everyone would be the same at the start, and they could end up very differently. It just made me think of that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, right? Because I think the moment if you are designing a game, and you have in mind that you're going to be playing it, of course you're going to want to skew the rules in your favor. So I think you're right. I think there is something interesting in that sort of says, actually, to get the best possible decision making, we need to unencumber people. And I think encumbrances come in all sorts of forms. But one of the most important encumbrances is protecting our own vested interests. And so I wouldn't necessarily go as far as the full end of that philosophy, but I think there is something interesting there that says, if we are taking this, and you can see it in governments, where people take decisions to sort of protect their own, and they often, sometimes they'll pay lip service to things like diversity, but they won't actually do things to change stuff. I do believe very much in the encumbrance is a dangerous thing. And if we can unencumber people with their thinking, we'll get better thoughts. So having people that are independent of a particular process that have no skin in the game, I guess, I do think is quite healthy now, admittedly, if you have zero skin in the game, you might end up with the opposite end of the spectrum, which is I don't understand the game. I don't understand what's going on. And of course, independence is one thing. Complete and utter ignorance of what it's like to be on the ground and participate in the game is another danger. So we have to kind of balance.
I feel like a lot of people feel like they don't have skin in the game, but I also feel by this stage that is no longer really possible. So, for example, I don't know if you or any of your listeners have recently seen The Social Dilemma. I don't think it's a very interesting film. The issue is I already knew most of what was going on because, I've got one foot in data science, I suppose, by this stage. But there is this thing where most people are like, oh, it's just social media, we just want to use it. It's just there for fun. It doesn't matter. And no one feels like they really have skin in the game. They just have a platform for their pictures and their friends. But you do have skin in the game because Facebook or anything affiliated to it or any type of social media platform knows everything about you. And if you perceive, and this is very visible with younger and younger generations who grew up with Facebook and haven't been taught to be critical of a platform that, they were literally born into almost, is that Facebook is also your news source and it shapes your view of the world. And it does so through targeting you very specifically. So what Facebook is doing is not giving you a representative view of the world. It's giving you a view of the world that is very much tailored to you and your inner circle, if you will. And that's very dangerous. And so a lot of people are very indifferent towards this. People are very indifferent to clicking accept all cookies, because if you don't click accept all cookies, the site doesn't work. So you don't really have that much of a choice. And I feel like a lot of people are like, by this age, either they don't really care enough, and that's completely valid, because if it's, being on Facebook versus not being able to pay your bills, I know which one of those would have my priority in the upcoming months. So I understand that people are a bit almost indifferent to it, maybe slightly ignorant of it. But by this stage, I feel like there is no real situation in which we no longer have skin in the game. I feel like that has kind of gone out of the world.
Yeah, and I also think that maybe we're putting too much of the responsibility on, the individuals and the consumers of these products. We had an episode where we talked to Kelly Shortridge, who works in information security. So this is all about, how hackable are people and sort of, people getting their data stolen, and how can we sort of improve people's behaviors around, not making the same password for every account that they have, things that we all do and we all know that we shouldn't do. And we say, okay, I know I shouldn't use the same password, but it's just so easy because it's just one thing to remember. And there's a lot that behavioral science can tell us, about how to help improve people's security. But currently there's pretty much no behavioral science that we could find that is being used by, big companies, big sort of tech companies, to help people protecting themselves and their own data as the default. So I think, a lot of these companies, it's in their own interest to collect as much data from you as possible and skirt around the sort of the ethical issue, creating just the opt out instead of opt in, and we've seen sort of the rise of the default in the conversation about nudge and how, just by changing the default, you can, change sort of very significantly the proportion of people who, opt in to, organ donation or are opted in, in the other sense. But even just looking at defaults, I think there's so much conversation to be had about the ethics of that and the sort of the assumptions that we are making about what people want for themselves. I think a lot of the time it's, inertia and laziness. And I think it's just human nature, in a sense, to be lazy, but I don't think that people should be punished for that.
Really struck by the comments you've made around critical thinking, because I think all of the way things are presented to us now discourages critical thinking. Because if we can make stuff super easy for you, just tick here and we'll sort this out for you. And as you've rightly pointed out, there are lots of situations where actually, if we just lazily float through life.
Yeah, but this is the thing, though. I don't think it's that lazily, not at all. So, for example, if I hope no one from the Warwick Business School is listening. If you are a representative, tune out. But it's just so if I think about this group of people that we are now accusing of going through life lazily. So people here that come to Warwick Business School, they do a degree in some type of pick an aspect of business, marketing, management, advertising, accounting. We've got them all. They go to this university, so getting into Warwick is not the easiest of things. Neither is getting into Nottingham, to not throw Sarah's alma mater under the bus.
No, I applied to Warwick, and Warwick did not want me, so that's a little chip on my shoulder. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, well, that's that dream crushed. And, So, and then you've got your courses here, and you do get a lot of coursework, and by this stage, the party aspect of university is over quite soon if you're in an accounting degree or an MBA degree here at Warwick. And then at the same time, you are being bombarded with social media and people telling you how you should be living your life. And the economics have changed around us. So currently, if you don't really come from parents that have a certain level of privilege, going to university and maintaining a certain set of lifestyle is very, very difficult, if not to say impossible. I can tell you Warwick Business School charges over £23,000 for a master degree. So I hope you've got that money in the bank, because otherwise your life's going to be very difficult. So say that at the same time you're trying to juggle a job. And by this stage, you're not lazy by any default. You're juggling an education, a job, the entire shenanigans of social media. But what's happening here, and this is something I find quite interesting, the process for all of this is quite linear. So if you're in the business school, or very likely doing any type of undergrad at Warwick, there is career fair after career fair after career fair. And because it's so normalized, what happens is that in your first year, you do an internship there. And at your second year, you do an internship there. And then you are preparing to roll into an undergraduate scheme for probably PwC or McKinsey or the whole thing. So this is very much a hamster wheel. And I feel like even if you take this beyond the context of Warwick Business School undergrads, loads of people are just on a hamster wheel. And if you don't realize you're in a hamster wheel, it is very easy to trick you. And that is a type of critical thinking that is no longer really being taught, but it's also a type of critical thinking where do you still find the energy or the time to engage in it? Because I've only just described the scenario and I'm exhausted.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of, hopefully, that's sort of what I meant, not necessarily sort of talking about laziness as sort of a character flaw and, sort of the image of someone who's just not, has everything available to them, but is not acting on it, out of just, it's like one of the 7 deadly sins or anything like that. But I was thinking more of more in terms of the fact that it's just not feasible. Our human brains are not designed to engage in critical thinking for every decision we make in the day. It wouldn't make sense to anyway. If you roll into a cafe and you want to choose, a coffee rather than going from your regular order, you could engage in a bit of critical thinking and ask the barista, do you have any of those latest beans? And what was the quality and the history? And maybe I'd quite like that. Or maybe should I?
Is this fair trade?
You could tie yourself around in circles. Yeah, trying to come up and optimize your decision, the little homo economist, the ultra rational person that a lot of economics has assumed represents human beings for a very long time. But I think it's one of those things where you just have to make a decision, active or passive, which choices you're going to engage with actively. And I think that's maybe what your point was about, Christian, about, engaging in critical thinking. Maybe there are some decisions that, like choosing a password, where we're sort of like, okay, yeah, this again, I've made 10 passwords already today. I've had to sign up for all of these different accounts. Yeah, I've already done the thinking and I know a password. It's just easier for me to use that one, right? Rather than maybe it's better for them to engage critical thinking. But
this reminds me of a great sketch. I think it's by Michael McIntyre, who just goes through this process of having to set up a password, and he just puts in password. And it's like, oh no, it needs to be capitalized. Okay, so now it's password with a capital P. It needs a number. Fine. Password with a capital P, 1. And then it also needs one of these special signs. So it's capital P, password, 1, exclamation mark. And in all fairness, the reaction of the audience is so embarrassed and cringing that you know for a fact at least 70% of them has that bloody password. And so there is really easy ways of, there's patterns in human behavior. There's patterns in our inertia and in our laziness. And I mean, it's really interesting to research, but once that research is out, it kind of loses academic value, but there's a lot of value to be gained from that stuff by companies who don't have your interest at heart. And I feel like that is, I mean, I'm not saying that certain research shouldn't come out, but we should maybe to some extent look better into what we're putting out in the world. Because once we're done with it as academics, that doesn't mean the rest of the world is done with that information as well. And a lot of really bad stuff has come out of nudging as well, known as the sludge.
I think this is fascinating because so you're spot on, Sarah, is that in terms of my view on laziness. So I didn't view laziness as a negative, and it's interesting. I've trained myself not to, but you make a very fair point, Merle, around that's the general perception. I just sort of look at it and go, by default, we have to kind of use shortcuts, as you both pointed out, to get through life. And what I think is interesting is that anybody that is creating choice architecture, be that a menu, be that using a default, whatever, should know this stuff. And what I think is fascinating is that we look at companies like Facebook and we go, they are clearly manipulating certain things and their algorithms. So there's the big bad person that needs some control, and we say that's the vulnerable people. But I think there's almost a point where it sort of says, actually, anybody that's creating an architecture of any choice architecture of any kind has a responsibility to think about how their users will react to it. And to kind of so this idea that we can now knowingly say, I wasn't aware it was having that form of impact. I think that's the bit I'd like to have blown open. And so I think often, and particularly in my field, when I look at sort of human risk and I go, here's somebody who's done something wrong. Typically, the person that sort of ends up holding the proverbial problem, it's not actually necessarily their fault. So you get a thing that sort of says, pilot crashed plane. Mm-hmm. Well, that's because the cockpit was crappily designed or the training was badly designed. But we point the finger at that person. And I think there's a lot of things here where we point the finger at users and we sort of go, well, you shouldn't have clicked that. If you didn't want this to happen, you shouldn't have clicked that. And yet it's the person that's designed it that hasn't thought this whole thing through. I'd like to see a massive shift, not only looking at these absolutely nefarious use of this stuff, but actually we need to start getting people to take a bit more responsibility for things, because there is this kind of implicit laziness on the part of designers who sort of go, you're almost saying, oh, well, I wasn't aware that people might think in those terms. And sometimes that's genuinely laziness on them where they kind of didn't think it through. Crappily designed government forms is my favorite example. Asking stupid questions or things that are contradictory or just did it cause massive amounts of stress. But you've also got people trying it on. I
mean, in all fairness, if I see a form that has questions in it that seem to sort of contradict each other, what my first thought is? Someone, definitely an experimental economist, designed this, and this is a survey. That is the first thing I think about. Because it's a check question. Because if you value thing A at 3, you can't later value thing B at 7 and then say that A is bigger than 7. Right. So I think that's like a consistency check. And then I'm like, oh my God, where is this form going?
Yeah.
Right. So it's basically a form type of capture, like the Google capture thing. You're basically going, we're just going to check you're human to make sure your answers are worth listening to.
Or at least transitive.
I wish that were true.
Some type of transitive or some type of conscious, if you will.
Oh, yeah. Many people would not pass the test and be classed as non-human. And the amount of times that you just get your wires crossed, you're like, well, actually, but I look at this comparison. Actually, maybe I do prefer this one over this one. And
but you said you didn't earlier on, so you're lying. You're lying. Okay.
Well,
Yeah, exactly. You've been totally inconsistent on this form, therefore not human.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a bit harsh.
Actually, that should be the sign of that you are actually human.
Yeah, exactly.
Only a robot would be perfectly consistent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a computer would be like, I prefer A over B, and then I prefer B over C, so I must prefer A over C. Like, a human will get that wrong so often.
But I mean, all of this stuff points to the power of behavioural science for good and for bad. And we've talked a little bit around nudge versus sludge, which is sort of obvious. And we've all been massively frustrated by processes that I mean, it seems to me that the room that we have to use some of this stuff to make the world better is extraordinary, really, as a powerful tool. And there's a lot of, particularly around the COVID thing, there's been a lot of noise around negative behavioural science. They've got it all wrong. But I look at it and say, I think this is a tremendous tool that we could use to save society huge amounts of time. Sure. We could improve the quality of decision making if we started to deploy this stuff more widely.
I think it's absolutely true. I think as long as there are humans in the system, behavioural science is going to tell us something about how to, make a process or a decision easier for someone, or how to make it harder, which is, the opposite. And there are some decisions maybe you do want people to take a bit more time over, and decisions where you actually want people maybe not to make it so instinctively. So
yes, most of what I study, please think a bit longer before you apply to a credit card. You don't want it. You don't need it.
Well, there's things as simple as like the bottle caps on medicine, or how many paracetamol do you put on one sheet, and the fact that they're individually packaged. Making that change, rather than having just a big pot where you can pour out all your medicine in one go. If you have to every time pop one out, it's gonna hopefully, and I think that it has been proven, I think there's been a study that just this change reduced the number of attempted suicides or successful suicides by overdose on painkillers. And it's things like that, if we think about guns as well, getting people to fill in more forms and to wait a bit longer before being able to get, their gun. In one context, we think, oh, this is really unnecessary and painful, and it's, making my whole experience of trying to get this thing that I want, really negative, and I'm really pissed off. But in some situations, maybe separating that instinct, for that gut instinct of like, I need to get a gun because maybe there is something that you would like to do with that gun, giving yourself a chance to cool off for a couple of days is actually potentially beneficial. But, that's a way of thinking as well, where we're not just taking into account the individual's well-being, but also everyone around the individual, which I think is interesting. Like, we always really focus on how do we increase an individual's decision-making capacity, and how can we get people to make better decisions? But I think there's also a question as to who is defining what a better decision is for an individual. Often we say a better decision, and we're talking about one decision for everyone that's better on aggregate.
Yeah, no, this is one of the main issues I had. I think not Sailor and Sunstein, I think they call it liberal paternalism, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time.
Libertarian paternalism.
It's been a long time since I read that book. And it's just, I have some issues with that term. I mean, in general, I'm not a massive supporter of any form of paternalism. I'm more of an anarchist. But that's really not necessary to know about me. But in general, there is the question of who decides what's good, what's right, but what's beneficial. But in that case, I would like a bit more context about who the choice is affecting. Because, and this maybe goes back to more complex decision making or like these integrated systems, but you can make a lot of choices in your life that don't affect anyone but yourself. But those are not all the choices that you make, because there's loads of choices that will affect other people, either now or in the future. And we know that when it comes to, for example, recycling is one of them. And we all know that the entire sustainability development is not going as quickly or as well as we all had hoped, because the idea that someone would have to separate their glass bottles from the rest of their trash, to many a person, is just something they are not willing to do. Or to quit using plastic is just too much to ask of a single person. But within a large system, within a society, an enormous amount of people making the same choice, or having the same type of laziness or inertia, if you will, does actually have serious detrimental effects. So I'm not exactly a green pusher, but these are things that we know happen. And then as a result, this one decision that an individual makes repeatedly, if a lot of people do that, this is detrimental and this will cost us the environment in the longer term. And of course, it's very difficult because it's you versus the entire society. So you're like, no, my decision won't affect that much. But also it's you versus the future. And by this stage, if you're not staring the future generations directly into the eyes, you don't really care. And we know that. I feel like there's loads of behavioral science to still be able to do there. But to some extent, and this is this is interesting to hear from a behavioral scientist, but I don't think there are a lot of very complex issues like this where I think behavioral science can help, but I don't think behavioral science is the solution. And what I have seen recently, of course, behavioral science, at least the behavioral insights units, they did start in the UK. And what I've seen within the UK, just specifically as an example, is that sometimes this unit, or the BIT, if you will, is doing work, like policy-related work, where I'm not entirely sure that's what they should be doing, to the extent that, to me, it looks like the government is too scared to implement very unpopular laws and very strong worded policies. And now it's just like, let the behavioral scientists do it, like maybe a bit more sneakily, maybe a bit more undercover, so people don't directly see what's going on and what we're pushing for. And then if it has a big enough effect, because some effects of these interventions are significant but quite small, then we'll take it. And it's just to some extent, and if it goes wrong, behavioral science is the scapegoat, and we're, as a government, we're fine. And I don't think this is just happening in the UK. I'm pretty sure other countries with BITs are having, similar things going on there. But behavioral science isn't always the answer. Sometimes it's just a very strong, very unpopular policy or law that needs to be implemented to change behavior. Because the one thing we know is that laws normalize or denormalize certain behaviors and create social norms. Smoking is a really good example of that. You're no longer to smoke inside buildings, so no one is anymore. And smoking did lose popularity as a result of it. That's not behavioral science, that's legislation. And sometimes that is the answer.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating when you look at it, because back to COVID, it's this, this is a behavioral science problem, we'll let them solve. What I think is really interesting is sometimes it gets in the headlines and is sort of the driving piece. And as you say, actually, there would be something else in the toolkit would be more powerful. But I think then there's other times where you've got the flip side, where it's sort of not considered at all. And it's kind of, we will just use blunt instruments that we have used from the past. Sure. And we will come with our carrot and our stick and we will resolve the problem that way. And I think it's very strange that we sort of bounce from one extremity to the other, which is sort of like, we will do everything through behavioral science. And you go, no, you won't. Or you'll get the opposite thing of, we will ignore this behavioral science stuff and we will continue. For me, it sort of sits in that middle ground. And then you get into that whole thing, well, what is behavioral science? A lot of people talk about nudge, like, behavioral science starts and finishes with nudging.
I hope not.
And I go, there's a whole load more stuff that's there that you wouldn't put anywhere near that category. And so I think one of the challenges is it's a neat headline. Either it's the tool that will solve everything, or it's sort of useless rubbish that can't be proven. And I think the truth lies in the middle. And I'm really intrigued as to where you see, definitionally. I mean, do you think the words behavioral science are unhelpful because it's been tarnished by some of these things we've been talking about?
I don't know. I don't know whether it's unhelpful. I actually think behavioral science is a term at the moment. I think it's the best one we have, because I think it points to the interdisciplinarity of the research, and just calling it behavioral economics, I think massively oversells the role that economics has had, and economists have had in shaping the discipline, because it's so much more than economists. Yeah. And as an economist, I can say that. Yeah.
Yes, you can.
I think it's interesting, this conversation, that we just had about how best to use behavioral science. And I think sometimes talking about behavioral science as a tool, I think it's a little bit misleading. I often think that behavioral science is more like a perspective or a way of thinking about the world, and is a complement to other types of policy tools. So, I mean, taking the example that Merle put forward about, if you wanted to decrease the number of people who are smoking, the policies that we know work, are taxation and legislation and banning smoking. But the question that a behavioral scientist would have would be, well, why? Why is it that no longer being able to smoke inside or inside this particular place? Why is that going to stop people from smoking? And then it's the question of, are people then, how are people, spending their time? Are they making more of an effort to go outside and spend more time outside and are still smoking the same amount, but just have changed where they're smoking? Is there something more to banning smoking in social spaces, so bars and restaurants, so maybe where people would think it's natural to have a cigarette alongside an alcoholic drink? Is there a difference from doing that to just banning it in like workplaces? So I think that sort of behavioral science, it offers an insight, not just into sort of like okay, this worked and this didn't. These are the predetermined outcomes that we've decided to measure, and this is how we're going to judge success. Because maybe there are unintended consequences. Looking at taxes on sugary items and alcohol and cigarettes, people have, it's being referred to as taxes on the poor, because actually maybe it doesn't decrease the amount that people are consuming or buying. It just means that they are spending more money on it and therefore don't have as much money to spend on other things. So I think behavioral science it's wrong to be classed as a tool, and sort of say that nudge is a tool. Because I think even that, I know I've said so much, I'm sorry, this is my last point. But even
I am hanging on your lips.
Okay.
Make it good, right? You've built this one up now. We're ready.
Okay. Well, so talking about nudge as a tool, I think there's even a question of what is a nudge? Because in the original definition, it was about, you don't make any changes to the number or types of decisions that people have in front of them. It's about not changing the choice architecture. And it's about not putting into practice things like financial incentives. So not, adding a fine or creating, a lottery or a chance to win money for doing something. Like those things are not definitionally nudges. But we know that there are lots of behavioral type interventions that have used money in interesting ways and have been effective, and sort of use this people's relationship with money, a good feeling you get when you win money, for example, capitalized on that. And that's a behavioral thing, it's like doing a behavior to receive a reward. So I think even when we distill behavioral science down to nudge, like I understand why people do it, because it's so neatly packaged as a tool. It's something that can be consumed by pretty much anyone and everyone, right? We're talking about self-control problems. It's something that has been framed in a way politically that will appeal to both sides of the aisle, and that was on purpose, right? It was to appeal to both liberals and conservatives. And it's also something that people in advertising have been using, so it's not a new concept, but it's just been packaged in this really neat, tight way that has meant it's incredibly consumable. And so I understand why people immediately associate nudge and behavioral science as being, oh, well, that is behavioral science.
I find it really interesting, Sarah, that you call nudge like just a repackaging of stuff that, we've already seen and heard before. Because that is, to get back to Christian's question, that is kind of how I feel about behavioral science. Because if I look at all of the research in behavioral science, of which I think nudge maybe makes up a decent 10%, if we just cut out all the media focus and look at what's actually being produced, then what I'm seeing is a lot of applied psychology. And we've had this discussion before, I'm pretty sure with Nick Hobson that we mentioned this, but maybe we've done this with Rory as well, Rory Sutherland from Ogilvy, also great to talk to. But a lot of the stuff that's going on in behavioral science is just applied psychology. It is literally just that, but psychology has gotten such a bad reputation over the year. Psychology, I think, was the first field in which the replication crisis hit, which then spilled over to other fields. But of course, if you're the first victim or the first mover, that can be a big disadvantage if the dominoes start falling down. And if you say psychology, or if you say to someone, and this is something I'm pretty sure Nick Hobson said, his family, because he knows he's a psychologist, but they still think he puts people on couches and has deep, meaningful conversations with them and potentially pumps the full of that. But in general, that's not really the focus of his work as a psychologist or of a social or emotional neuroscientist, if you will, because I think that's what his PhD is in. But it's just this idea, like psychology has gotten the worst reputation, but a lot of what we do in behavioral science is applied psychology. So after a while, we are just almost repackaging things. And it sounds really negative, but I don't mean it that way. But a whole lot of things that we've done is take the best from certain fields, such as economics, such as applied psychology. We've taken lots of things from neuroscience. We've taken quite a few things from philosophy, jammed them into this new field, maybe called them something slightly different, and made it very easy to sell. Because if there's one thing that behavioral science is, it's very sellable. So we've just taken the best of, asked Rory Sutherland, or pick a different marketing guru, like, hey, fix this up, and let's do it. And that, to me, is a lot of behavioral science. And it is true that nudge, in the original definition, which Sarah already alluded to, is a very quick fix, tends to be very fast to do, very cheaply. And that is the original nudge. But people have taken this tool, because it's a tool and very much not a theory. Like if someone comes to me talking about nudge theory, I'm running out of the room. That is not a conversation I want to be having. And it's turned into, it's eating itself whilst having turned into Frankenstein's monster. It's loads of people no longer know what the original concepts are, what it was meant to be, what it never was meant to be. Nudge was never a theory. And it was never meant to be. It doesn't predict behavior. It doesn't really explain behavior, but it gives you guidelines towards maybe manipulating behavior in sort of intuitive, very easy to understand ways. And that is a good tool, but that can backfire just as easily. And that is something that people just don't really think about as much as I would like.
I agree. And I'm struck very much around, Sarah, you said something about where the unintended consequences. And I sort of push that a little bit further. And my start point is that there will always be unintended consequences, because none of these things are sort of guaranteed. And so I like to look at it as a sort of side effect. So I take my packet of prescription pills and say, we take those because largely they do the right thing, but there are side effects that you can read about on the side of the packaging. And I think most of the time what happens is people implement these things. So I now have the solution, and we don't think about the side effects / unintended consequences. So I always like to start from the premise that there will be some. Now, if it turns out that they're minor or that we can't even see them, then maybe that's fine. But I think it's really interesting that sort of there is this kind of, I will do this and then we'll be sorted. When actually, as we've been talking all along, this is nuanced and vague, and it'll play with some people, a bit like music. So some artists are liked by lots of people, whereas other artists are sort of more of a niche taste. And there's there's some people who pretend to like artists that they don't actually like in order to seem cool. And so I think there's an interesting thing here that sort of says it seems to be binary. Does this work or not? Whereas we know it's a damn sight more complicated.
And I think you've always got to remember that, we all suffer from hindsight bias. This idea of how could you possibly have not known that this would have this effect? Like, it's so obvious.
You're an idiot.
When you look at everything, all the information that we have, it's so obvious that this causes this. But I think...
Or the other way around, where you have an intervention where it's like, oh, it worked brilliantly. And then some people go, yeah, of course it works brilliantly. And then they move on, not knowing at all why something is working. Which I think is actually a foundational part of the replication crisis. We saw things that worked, and we replicated it, and then it stopped working. And never did we ask ourselves, until things went wrong, why that was. You can't just take a success. You need to know why something works, which I think the replication crisis, to that extent, was very eye-opening, because that was a really good motivator for people to start asking themselves, why? And that wasn't just in academia, that was also on the practitioner side, that was for individuals, not even, people who were actively engaged in behavioral science. But you need to know why. A good outcome isn't good enough in itself.
But it's one of those things where it's not always possible to really, truly understand why. We can come up with ideas and, that sound really convincing. And, here's all these possible theories and mechanisms that we think are driving this effect. But it's one of these things where I think you're right, Christine. I think you have to go in to a situation expecting that there will be unintended consequences, even if, looking at it from the perspective that you are before it's actually been implemented, you can't really see how could this possibly go wrong? Like, you can't consider everything because we're not computers again. We're not, running these, algorithms in our heads of sort of playing out all these different scenarios. It's
even then, I think, because one of the big things with big data, which is why, big data isn't the be all end all either. And this is something I remember from the conversation we had with Rory. Data, so the data that we have is all past data. So what that data can do is give you a very accurate image of the past and go correlationally to some extent in predicting, explaining, or painting some type of a picture of the future. But this is the same with algorithms, where people are thinking that an algorithm will be flawless, and it's not because it's based on the past. So what we're seeing then is that an algorithm can only really come up with what it has already seen before, or combinations of what it has already seen before. An algorithm is not likely to come up with an unintended consequence that we have no reason to believe exists because we've never seen it before. An algorithm, I mean, maybe machine learning to some extent is going that way, but as we are now, I don't think we can do that either. So that's not really as feasible as people think. So I hope we'll get better at it, but coming up with these things as a person or as an algorithm is still a nightmare.
It surprises me that people still think that economists can predict the future and are really angry when it turns out the prediction is wrong.
Yes, Sarah. What do you mean you weren't able to predict the financial crisis? You could have warned me.
But isn't that the kind of point that we like simplistic explanations, right? So I think weather forecasting is a really good example, right? Where on the one hand, they get it right quite a lot, right? And they're pretty good. So we've got a rough idea, but they're also quite crap. And I live in London. And so you get a weather forecast for London that covers a ludicrously large territory where anyone who's got half a brain would realize that you can't, it's Gatwick in the south to Stansted Airport in the north. It's a massive amount of territory. And you know that if you walk for 5 minutes, you can walk from rain to not rain in the UK very, very quickly, typically more rain than not, as we know. But I think it's fascinating that we like this thing. We like the idea of a weather forecast because we go, aha, I know what the weather's going to do. Now, you might be an idiot like me, watch the weather forecast, still have no clue because you haven't really been paying attention. But you like this simplicity. And I think economics is a similar kind of thing. It's a nice, simple explanation. This is how it will work. And we build all these models and things off the back of it. And then we wonder why, when we've sort of accepted these simplistic models because it's convenient to do so, we then go, oh, why didn't that accurately work? That's really outrageous that didn't work. And yet we know that it's in the very simplicity that appeals to us. And I think there's something fascinating about how we think about problems, which is we do like to reduce it to simple things. If someone comes selling a simple solution, and that might be a politician, that might be a weather forecast, that might be an economist, I'll have a bit of that because that's nice and easy.
And that's where Nudge went wrong. Or that's where Nudge went right. It was easy to sell, and then it kind of spun out of control. But this is also one of the issues I have with popular science books. Especially within behavioral science, because that's the field I know of, where a lot of these things are just proposed and propagated in such simple terms, not mentioning the context or all the numerous caveats that came with doing that research and obtaining a certain result. And I feel like that is something that we're going to see more and more of a backlash from.
Yeah. It doesn't make good reading, does it? Reading a 50,000 page book about one concept, going through all the different times it was replicated and it wasn't. So, I think you're right. I think behavioral science needs to come with a bit more of a caveat. Like that asterisk needs to be a bit large and in bold. Yeah.
1 asterisk, 2 asterisks, 3 asterisks.
Because, when we're dealing with humans and human behavior, we are trying to make sense of things that sometimes don't make sense at all. And that's the challenge. We're constantly trying to impose like this narrative, because that's also what humans do. We try to make sense of sometimes the complete sheer randomness of life by, trying to build stories and explanations and cause and effect. Like that's our natural instinct to do it, because, I think we'd all be mad if we weren't doing that. It's a very human endeavor. But I think, we just need to make that asterisk a bit bigger. And I think people need to maybe have more realistic expectations of what behavioral science can do, because the actual effect sizes are small. When we look at successful behavioral by itself interventions. And that's not necessarily to say that means that we shouldn't bother at all, because actually these marginal improvements in the way that the system works. I think, Kristin, you were talking a bit earlier about, how to design a cockpit, to try and get pilots to avoid making the same errors again and again. And I think this is actually related a little bit to, I've got a research project which is looking at mistakes, and we use sort of the airline industry as sort of a motivating story to that. And there was a story of essentially in World War II, the inside of a cockpit was designed, the levers to pull down the wheels and to release the wing flaps of the landing gear were pretty much the same and right next to each other. So if you're in a situation, a high pressure situation where you're like, I need to land this plane now, I don't know, maybe one of your engines is on fire. And in that moment of complete, panic, or, you have no time, so you're under intense scarcity, which is really all economics is. It's just looking at scarcity. And you just reach for the nearest one, and maybe it's the wrong one. Maybe your wheels don't come down and you crash the plane. Through an effective reporting system, we were able to figure out, okay, a lot of people seem to be making the same mistake of pulling the wrong lever. The question is why? Well, they look very similar. So I think today in cockpits, the actual levers to lower the wheels actually have a little wheel on the front of it. And they're completely different shapes and like textures and everything like that. But that little minor improvement has, we don't know how many plane crashes have been avoided because of this now, because it's changed. All we know is that, the number of times people are mixing these things up has reduced. So that's a really good example of how thinking about behavior and systems and putting in these minor improvements can have a real effect, even if the effect size isn't huge.
I mean, you're messing with lives here. So, I mean, if a plane crashes, like not many people will walk out of a broken down plane. So even if you've only, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, saved 2 planes from crashing, if those are like those big ass Boeings, that's hundreds of people. That's a damn good result. Even with that example, you could argue that isn't necessarily just behavioral science. That's so many other disciplines coming in and thinking of a solution. The way that we design the levers and people who've studied design or have studied actual, I want to say mechanics.
It's ergonomic.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So there's from a different lens, it's not behavioral science at all. Like if you had a completely different set of training, you could still have found the solution. So,
well, and some of it, of course, is common sense, right? So what you described there, if you put 2 things next to each other that are very similar, that do very different things, one of which is highly desirable in certain circumstances, and the other one is highly undesirable, don't be surprised when you've got people that are under pressure. So I think a lot of this, for me, a lot of the stuff, you just look at it and go, and this isn't always hindsight bias. Some of it is just like, well, that was bloody obvious. But because you've spent your whole time, if you're the designer of this thing, you're not thinking about it from the user's perspective because you spent your whole life looking at this thing and going, well, it's obvious that these 2 different things are different. You're not putting yourself in that end user position. And I think that's a really, really good example around often when we design stuff, we design it and I see this in organizations, people who are in charge of a process that the individuals within the organization do once a year. And if you're designing that process and that's all you do, you're steeped in this stuff. So you have no hope in hell of putting yourself in the shoes of someone who does this thing once a year next to 1,000,001 other things. And so you can design it perfectly for you, but you've designed it appallingly for them. And I think one of the things that I find fascinating about some of this stuff is, yes, you can go and read a whole load of research, but a lot of it is just step back and think about what it's like from the perspective of the people actually going to be using it. And don't think about it from your perspective, but think about it
again, the empathy gap. We just need to close the empathy gap, and how many of our problems would be, much more
reduced.
Yeah, much reduced. Not necessarily gone, but I think problems would be easier to.
Amazing. Look, I think that's a very positive note on which to end. So firstly, I just wanted to say thank you for being on the podcast. You've been great guests. So this is not hindsight bias. I knew this was going to be fascinating. I knew we'd go to some amazing, interesting places. So thank you for that. And thank you also for all the work that both of you are doing, both the podcast, but all the other things that you do, putting stuff out there, because I think the behavioral science discussion and debate, as we have seen, is much richer for your input. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much for having us, and thanks for the compliment.
Thanks. It was great. It was great to be in a bit of a role reversal. I feel so much more relaxed this side of the microphone, for sure.
Oh, yeah. It's much better to be interviewed, for sure.
Very relaxing.
Look, thank you so much. Been a huge pleasure.
Thank you so much.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Sarah and Merle for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about their Questioning Behaviour podcast and Merle's Money on the Mind blog, have a look in the show notes. There are details of both there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, you can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the podcasting platforms. I will be back very soon with another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.